and thank you for choosing to listen to The Current Travesti Experience, a discursive exploration of Kulick's A Man in the House. My name is Noelle, and I'm joined here today by Jude.
Hi.
And Matisse.
Hi.
We're here to discuss our thoughts on Kulick's article, A Man in the House, the boyfriends of Brazilian travesti prostitutes, and to expand on his work by considering how more recent accounts of travesti lifestyles have changed or been in opposition to Kulick's original piece. First, we'll provide a bit of a background on the meanings behind masculinity that exists in Latin America, focusing on dominant forms of masculinity, including machismo. That will provide a nice backdrop for then discussing how Kulick's work and his account of travesti identity fits into dominant ideals of masculinity. Finally, we will discuss what we three have individually investigated before this recording on Kulick's account, as well as how these accounts align with each other and kind of discuss Kulick's ideas back and forth. We believe this is an important topic to discuss because we find that Kulick's account needs expanding upon and to be brought into present-day perspectives of fluid masculinity and femininity. Before we start, we want to put out a disclaimer out there that this video will discuss topics of drug use, sexual activity, and explicit language, and discretion is advised. But now Matisse can get us started by providing a backdrop on what general ideas of masculinity are in Latin America.
Awesome, thank you. I wanted to take a moment to talk about masculinity in Latin America more broadly because it gives us a really important framework for understanding not only how travestis perform gender, but also what kinds of masculinity they're reacting to, resisting, or even reproducing in some ways. One of the dominant cultural scripts in Latin America is machismo, which refers to an ideal of manhood centered on physical strength, emotional control, sexual dominance, and patriarchal authority. In class, we talked about how machismo isn't just behavior, it's also about power. It tells men that they must be protectors, providers, and above all, not feminine. And this idea gets reinforced in everything from family structure to media to religion. But what's really interesting, and what we saw in Santos' article about evangelical men in El Salvador, is that masculinity in Latin America can also be transformed. Though often in ways that still rely on hierarchy, Santos shows how men who convert to evangelical Christianity adopt a new type of masculinity, one that's quote-unquote clean, emotionally present, and rooted in biblical authority. But even this reformed masculinity still centers men as the heads of the household and moral leaders. A quote from the article that stuck with me was, "Evangelical masculinity then is constructed by these men in opposition to all other masculinities. It is necessarily a better masculinity because they have been saved by Christ and other men have not." This is a key insight, not just that masculinity can change, but that's often built through contrast, defining what is not. This connects directly to how travestis seek out hypermasculine boyfriends, often men who are strong, stoic, and dominant. Because those qualities still signal manhood under a machista framework, even as travestis blur gender lines, they're still navigating a society where masculinity is clearly defined and policed. So whether it's through religion, culture, sexuality, Latin America masculinity is constantly being performed, reshaped, and judged, not just by women or queer folks, but by the men themselves. That's kind of the backdrop that we have to keep in mind as we look at how travestis build relationships, perform gender, and assert agency. Now, I want to open it up to Jude or Noelle. Do you want to jump in with any other sources that we found?
Yeah, I would like to talk about a piece that the BBC News put out called Struggling with Sexism in Latin America. And this piece just kind of highlights how femininity also works within this system of masculinity, because usually the victims of machismo or hegemonic masculinity in Latin America is not only men who are expected to perpetuate these stereotypes, but also women who definitely are subjects of sexism and sexual violence and harm. Although this is still kind of a debate between people in Latin America, it's hard to tell whether machismo is this sort of like protective, like helpful type of masculinity to protect women, or if it is just blatant sexism. The blur between that like line can be kind of seen there.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect transition into actually discussing Kulick's article, A Man in the House. Kulik observes a household of travesti prostitutes and their boyfriends while he lives with them for 2 years in Salvador, Brazil. According to Kulik, travesti is a word in Brazilian Portuguese derived from transvestir, or cross-dress. Travestis are men who from youth modify their bodies and personal styles to reflect traditional understandings of femininity. Cosmetics, hormones, women's clothes, and silicone implants are all used in varying degrees. It's important to understand that travesti do not want to be female, nor do they consider themselves to be women. They just desire to be feminine. Kulik claims that they self-identify as homosexual. It became quickly apparent to Kulik that travesti put a lot of social importance onto their boyfriends, that they are a near central consideration in their lives. Thus, Kulik believes that without understanding the role that a travesti's boyfriend plays in their life, we cannot completely understand their lives at all. It's notable, like Matisse alluded to, that travestis specifically seek out boyfriends who are hypermasculine. They're handsome, they're muscular, and they often have tattoos. It's notable also to mention that these men quit working when they get into relationships with travesti, often at her own request. A boyfriend will most likely be a man in the community who has not been a paying client. Sometimes a man who is considered a vice will become a boyfriend. A vice is someone who a travesti is attracted to and who they see without charge. Kulik observes that there is occasionally brutal competition for these men among travestis. Many travesti that Kulik conversed with wanted to emphasize that these relationships were based on travesti agency. They wanted to please their boyfriends, give them money and presents, but it was in order to dominate them. The relationship dynamic is based on feeling powerful in relation to another person, a power play. The boyfriends know that if they displease their travesti partners, that they will have nothing. Here there is an inversion of gender because boyfriends, for all their masculine props, are feminized. Kulik wants to break down the intricacies of their gender and sexuality within travesti-boyfriend relations. Travesti are uninterested in men who share their sexual desire, thus their relationships are based on sexual difference. Travestis desire males while their boyfriends desire females. It is important that travesti boyfriends only take the penetrative role during sex, because in doing so they're being real men. Manhood, it seems, is not just how you act or where your interests lie, but crucially depends on what you do in bed. According to Kulik, this stems from not wanting their boyfriends to turn into women by giving their ass on the street like they do. Kulik describes a travesti conceptualization of their gender as such. Travestis consider themselves like women, like them in feeling, taste, emotion, interest, erotic desire. Kulik makes sure to mention that travesti think that any biological male who claims to actually be a woman is mentally disturbed. Thus, to Kulik's observation, it is in bed where gender is truly established. The point of a boyfriend is to make a travesti truly feel like a woman. A real man will look like one and act like one, particularly in bed. Travestis are not entirely interested in sexual gratification when they take their boyfriends to bed. They are interested in gender affirmation. All of that to be said, that there are a few noticeable gaps in Kulik's article. We're not given a history of travesti identity, nor are we given nearly any mention of Brazilian or Latin American transgender men and women, who also operate on the fringe of traditional gender, and how that's meant to operate. Did you guys pick out any noticeable holes in Kulik's article that you'd like to help fill?
Yeah, so something that actually stuck out to me that I've been thinking of ever since reading Kulik was I kind of got that it almost feels like the travesti experience can be shortened down to a single narrative. And so that's when I would like to bring in another scholar that I've looked at, Varda Bien Cabral. In her book, Brazilian Travesti Migrations, she goes a step to argue that the movement of travestis, both literally across borders and socially across gendered expectations, is actually central to their identity. She writes that travesti migrations are not just a matter of displacement or survival, but actually acts of self-construction and a way of claiming space and shaping who they are. So on page 43, she says, travesti migrations are not merely displacements or escapes, but affirmations of subjectivity, ways of constructing the self through movement and space, which is different from Kulik's approach, which is grounded of an observation in a single household. In Brazil, Kulik gives his detailed view of relationships and household dynamics, but it's anchored in one place, and it doesn't necessarily capture the fluid, transitory nature of travesti life. And more importantly, Kulik doesn't fully consider how external forces like state violence, economic precarity, and border politics shape gendered experiences. Cabral helps us see that travestis are not just subjects of desire or domination in relationships, that they're also navigators of the system, using mobility to assert their agency in the face of social and structural marginalization, and that is something that Kulick's work opens the door to, but it doesn't ultimately explore.
Yeah, I had a very similar source to kind of align with that main point as well, by Andrea Rocha Rodriguez, called Perpetual Motion, Displacement of Travestis from an Ethnographic Perspective, which pretty much claims exactly the same thing, that this migration displacement isn't necessarily in an echo chamber or a vacuum, but also perpetuates their lifestyle and the travesti experience, and instead of being like a hindrance or an extra part of their lives, it is kind of a part of how they generate their identity as well. And she actually puts like a term to this called a perpetual motion machine, she says, which reuses indefinitely the energy generated by its own movement, which I found that quote to be a very kind of artistic way of looking at it, but also very specifically calls out Kulik and other scholars who have studied travesti life in the past, saying that they often overlook the importance of displacement and migration. Which I feel like I can directly call Kulik out by saying that, especially after listening to what Jude said, is that Kulik puts so much emphasis on the personal relationships that they have with the travesti, and a main part or point of Kulik's account is that we should look beyond just the prostitution itself and look more into personal relationships. However, he almost puts so much focus on personal relationships that he misses these other points as well, including this like importance of migration and displacement that we were talking about before.
Yeah, that's really, I think, very important. Both of you mentioned that Kulik kind of reinforces a singular narrative of travesti experience, which I also really appreciated about an article on travesti and their clients by Larissa Pelucio. She made it out to be super important that everyone understand that travesti experience is inherently plural. That isn't something that we see in the Kulik article. In fact, Kulik often seems to emphasize a united front in the travesti experience. We're meant to understand that the travesti experience is one and the same between each person. Pelucio, on the other hand, emphasizes an almost umbrella-like experience. For example, unlike Kulik, Pelucio describes travesti who don't take hormones or seek out body modification. Unlike Kulik as well, Pelucio gives a brief background on travesti. That is where their name came from. Colloquially, travesti were collectively referred to this way because they were travestis, as men who dress as women are travestis. Pelucio mentions that travesti are molded by social expectations of hegemonic masculinity. Although they destabilize the gender binary, within their sexual expression, they reinforce and normalize heterosexuality. According to Pelucio, there's a social ambivalence towards travesti. Society has a general inability to situate them within the boundaries of gender and sexuality, making them largely fascinating but socially damaging. A transgressive body associated with social deviance and impurity should not be desired or loved by men who see themselves as good heterosexual men, and yet they are. Maybe this is the reason why men who seek out travesti companionship classify that companionship as a vice or an addiction. In Kulik's article, boyfriends are undesirable to travesti if they want to be penetrated because they act as women or as faggots. Pelucio offers a different view, which is, in modernity, according to travesti, a real man is one who does not deny himself or give in to fear. Travesti, who enter the world every day and night, proudly and openly as they are, believe that real men don't hide what they are or what they want. Now, don't get me wrong, if you want to be penetrated, you're still a faggot, according to the travesti that Pelucio interviewed. But this is because, according to her, the ass is linked to the feminine no matter whose ass it is. Because socially, the act of penetration is inherently masculine, which feminizes the penetrated by default. This isn't necessarily socially alien to us, though as Americans, because this is historically common thinking, it was much more socially damaging to be a bottom or a receiver, because not only were you queer, but you were an effeminate one. Nevertheless, according to Pelucio's travesti, those who get penetrated by travesti are at least courageous enough to reveal their true desires. Something that Kulik only briefly touches on is gender affirmation. Pelucio, however, did a lot of research into online forum spaces for clients of travesti. These clients universally see travesti as the perfect women. According to Pelucio, this is sex detached from gender. a strategy that allows clients to affirm their own masculinity in contrast to travesti femininity. This is Judith Butler's gender intelligibility matrix, which orients speech by clients and travesti to guide perceptions of their sexuality, while at the same time destabilizing their norms.
Yeah, that piece also reminded me a lot of a piece that I found, it's very funny how that's working out here, called Queering the Debate, Analyzing Prostitution Through Dissident Sexualities in Brazil by Amanda Ferreira. And Amanda Ferreira kind of talks about how, similar to what you were talking about in the opener of that piece, how travestis are both kind of challenging these like gender expectations, but also using these same gendered terms to define their own gender identity. And Ferreira kind of notes this as subjects of adjectation that she claims that the travestis are. In this context, adjectation means being subjected to being othered in society, but this otherness both only reinforces the normativity of normative groups, because in order to have normative groups, you have to have othered groups. But also, these othered groups also still use hegemonic, in this case, masculine language to describe their complex existences. And it's very interesting, this almost aligns with what Kulik says, where he almost always emphasizes that it's a form of masculinity and not its own separate form of gender identity. And I think Ferreira would agree that this is being defined in this way by the travesti community, but it might also just be harmful to its own project and be a product of being interworked in this Western and colonialized kind of language of talking about masculinity and gender identity. And without this, it might be able to break through that and maybe have a travesti experience that's more realized, that doesn't have to filter itself through masculine terms and norms.
That's so interesting. Speaking of that filtering, Adrian Rosenberg offers us a history of Brazilian LGBT fight for human rights in what she calls the Brazilian paradox. Amazingly, homosexuality has been legal in Brazil since 1823. Brazil, being known as an emerging activist state for its progressive domestic and global pushes for LGBT rights, has also functioned within the paradox of being the worst transgressor of homophobic and transphobic discrimination. Violence against LGBT people is ranked higher in Brazil than in the United States and Europe combined. Rosenberg labels it the world's most sexually liberal country for heterosexual behavior. Brazil operates as a patriarchal society, as we've said, with a strong emphasis on male-dominated sexuality. Within the society, Rosenberg notes that men who are the active, penetrating partner in a homosexual relationship are not discriminated against because they are acting as the male, while those who are receiving an effeminate are effeminate homosexuals. This seems to reflect and enforce the sexual dynamic of travesti-boyfriend relationships. And before we move on, I wanted to mention that Rosenberg used the word transvesti for those of variant gender identities as an umbrella term, which I really liked. I wonder if this term will emerge in trans and queer Latin American scholarship in the future.
Yeah, very interesting.
Which is interesting also because, as we mentioned, Kulik doesn't actually openly discuss Latin American or Brazilian trans men and women. But Mir Yarfitz and Marcy Joan Butrias mentions in their article about trans and travesti identities throughout South American history that travestis were once only known as men who dressed as women in theatrical performances. In the 70s, it began to refer specifically to sex workers who feminized their bodies. In the 70s, there began to be a noticeable division between trans women known as marcia and travestis, as travesti became its own unique identity category. Nevertheless, throughout history, and especially throughout fights for human rights in the coming decades, trans women and travestis worked alongside one another. In 1973, travestis and marcia marched side by side in what would later be known as Latin America's first Pride March to protest the murder and police violence that was happening in their communities. Also very notable that it was their collective organization that led to future HIV and AIDS preventative work.
Based on our discussions of hegemonic meanings of Latin American masculinity, Kulik's account of travesti life in Brazil, and the numerous accounts of travesti life that followed his, it is clear that travestis are a site of diverse gender expression that can illuminate our understandings and misunderstandings of how gender can operate on a social, political, and cultural scale. Although Kulick's work provided a strong foundation of anthropological work on the lives of the travesti, his work fails to account for how travestis form their identities outside of personal relationships and sexual activity, the pluralism of their identities, and overall how travesti lives challenge Western and colonialist systems of oppression in the form of socialized gender norms. Thank you for listening, and make sure to check out any sources that we used in the video description below.